Powerful real estate developer Marcus Reid threatened to bulldoze 80-year-old Walter Erickson's heritage farm, neither man imagining that a decades-old military secret hidden beneath the property would bring a presidential helicopter landing in those contested fields, carrying the one person whose arrival would make the ruthless businessman turn pale with panic and change the fate of an entire rural community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Walter Erickson never expected to be the last farmer standing in Riverdale County. At 80 years old, his weathered hands told the story of 6 decades working the rolling hills of Pinewood Valley Farm, a 175-acre property that had been in his family since 1943. While neighboring farms had gradually sold to developers, Walter's land remained a stubborn island of agriculture in what was rapidly becoming an ocean of luxury housing developments. For Margaret Erickson, Walter's only child, her father's determination to keep farming had become a source of both pride and frustration. At 46, she had built a successful career as an environmental attorney in Boston, specializing in land conservation cases that often put her against the same kind of developers now circling her father's property. "Dad, please consider the assisted living option," Margaret urged during their weekly call. "Dr. Reeves says your arthritis is worsening. You can't manage the farm alone anymore." "I buried your mother under the oak tree by the creek," Walter replied simply. "Promised her I'd look after this place till I joined her there. Some promises matter more than comfort, Maggie." Their conversation was interrupted by Walter's startled exclamation as several black SUVs rolled past his window. "They're back again," he muttered. "That developer and his surveyors, measuring right up to my property line every day, like vultures circling." The call ended with their usual impasse, Walter refusing any changes, Margaret promising to visit soon while researching options that might allow her father to stay on his beloved farm with support. 3 days later, that promise became urgently necessary when Walter's neighbor Bill Jenkins called Margaret in agitation. "Your father's in the hospital, Maggie. Nothing life-threatening. Fell trying to repair the tractor. Dislocated shoulder and bruises. But there's something else. That developer who bought the Hendersons' place, he was here with city officials yesterday. Overheard them talking about eminent domain and infrastructure necessities that would cut right through your dad's property." Margaret was on the next flight to Westfield Regional Airport. Her calendar cleared despite critical case deadlines. Driving along rural routes, she was struck by how dramatically the landscape had changed since her last visit. What had once been a patchwork of family farms was now predominantly construction sites and housing developments with names like Harvest Estates and Heritage Hills, sanitized references to the agricultural legacy they had replaced. Pinewood Valley Farm appeared around a bend in the road, its white farmhouse and red barn standing in stark contrast to the partially constructed luxury homes visible just beyond its boundary. The property looked smaller than Margaret remembered, its borders pressed upon by development, closing in from all sides. Walter was seated on the porch when she arrived, his right arm in a sling, and his expression a mixture of pain and embarrassment. "Didn't need to come all this way," he said gruffly. "Just a little tumble." "Well, I'm here now," Margaret replied, noting how much her father had aged. "And it sounds like we have things to discuss about the farm situation." Walter's expression darkened. "That Reid fellow thinks he can buy anything. Offered 3 times market value last month, then got nasty when I refused. Now he's talking to county commissioners about road expansions and utility corridors that would carve up my fields." Margaret recognized the name immediately. Marcus Reid of Reid Development Group, a regional powerhouse in luxury real estate with a reputation for aggressive tactics and political connections. She had faced his company in conservation cases before. "Let me see what they've sent," she said, slipping into her professional role. In the kitchen, stacks of official-looking letters covered the table. Margaret quickly sorted through them, her concern growing as she recognized the escalating legal pressure. The most recent document was a preliminary notification of potential eminent domain proceedings for a utility corridor that would effectively divide the farm in half. "This is clearly strategic," she concluded. "They're using the developments they've already built as justification for infrastructure that would make your property unworkable as a farm, forcing you to sell." Walter nodded grimly. "But there's something else. Last week I caught fellows in unmarked vans taking soil samples along the ridgeline. When I confronted them, they claimed to be from the county environmental department but wouldn't show ID. Called the county later. They hadn't authorized any testing. Did you report it?" Sheriff's deputy took a report, but nothing came of it. Said, without proof of damage, there wasn't much they could do. Walter's face showed resignation. "Things have changed, Maggie. The farms used to matter. Now it's all about development money and tax revenue." After getting her father settled, Margaret walked the property boundaries, noting survey markers that seemed freshly placed. As she approached the ridgeline, where Walter had reported the unauthorized testing, she noticed something odd, a section of ground that appeared to have been recently excavated and then carefully restored. It wouldn't have been noticeable to someone unfamiliar with the property, but Margaret recognized that something about the soil distribution looked different. Her inspection was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. 3 black SUVs pulled up at the farm's gate, and several men in business attire emerged, led by Marcus Reid himself. "Ms. Erickson, I presume," Reid said with practiced charm. "I was hoping to speak with your father, but perhaps it's fortunate we meet instead. Your reputation in environmental law precedes you." Margaret maintained professional composure. "Mr. Reid, this is private property, and my father is recovering from an injury. Any matters concerning this farm should be addressed through proper legal channels." Reid's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've been attempting that for months, but your father seems resistant to even the most generous offers. Perhaps you can help him understand the inevitable direction of progress in this region." He gestured toward a man in a county government blazer. "Commissioner Davis can confirm that the infrastructure plans have already been approved. The utility corridor through this property is not a matter of if, but when. We're simply offering your father the opportunity to benefit substantially, rather than face lengthy, eminent domain proceedings with less favorable compensation." "As I'm sure you're aware," Margaret countered, "eminent domain requires proving public necessity, not merely convenience for adjacent development projects. Any claim would face rigorous legal challenge." Reid's smile tightened. "Challenge requires resources, Ms. Erickson. Even with your considerable skills, fighting both a well-funded development company and county government would be prohibitively expensive for a retired farmer." Before Margaret could respond, Walter emerged from the house, moving slowly but deliberately toward them. "Thought I recognized your voice, Reid," he called. "Didn't expect you'd bring the entire circus just to harass an old man." Reid's tone shifted to exaggerated concern. "Mr. Erickson, we're all disturbed to hear about your accident. It only highlights the challenges of maintaining this property at your age. We're simply trying to offer a solution that benefits everyone." "Benefits everyone, except the folks who've stewarded this land for generations," Walter shot back. The confrontation was interrupted by Margaret's phone ringing. Seeing an unknown local number, something made her answer rather than let it go to voicemail. "Ms. Erickson, this is Dr. Abernathy from Westfield Historical Society. Your father asked me to review some unusual items he found near the old ridge. Line bunker. I've completed my analysis and, well, I think you both should hear these results immediately. They may have significant implications for the property's status." When she ended the call, Reid was watching her intently, clearly trying to assess whether it might affect his plans. "Gentlemen, my father needs rest, and we have appointments tomorrow regarding the property," Margaret stated firmly. "I suggest you submit any proposals in writing. This conversation is over for today." As the vehicles departed, Walter turned to his daughter. "What did Abernathy want? He's been helping me document the farm's history for county records." "Dad, what exactly is the ridgeline bunker he mentioned, and what items did you find there?" Walter sighed, glancing toward the ridge where Margaret had noticed the disturbed soil. 3 weeks ago, that big storm washed out part of the hillside, exposed what looked like an old concrete entrance. Found some metal boxes inside with military markings. Took them to Abernathy rather than the sheriff. "And you think this might have something to do with Reid's interest in the property?" "Timing seems suspicious," Walter admitted. "Those soil testers showed up 2 days after I found the bunker, and Reid's offers jumped significantly the following week." As twilight settled over the farm, Margaret helped her father back to the house, her mind racing. Whatever Walter had discovered might be far more significant than either realized. Significant enough to attract unauthorized soil testing and accelerated pressure from a developer suddenly in a hurry to gain control of the property. What neither could know was that the contents of those metal boxes would soon draw attention far beyond a county developer. Attention that would arrive dramatically by helicopter and forever change the course of their fight to save. Pinewood Valley Farm. The Westfield Historical Society occupied a renovated Victorian mansion on the town's main street, its imposing architecture a reminder of the region's prosperous agricultural past. Dr. Lawrence Abernathy, a wiry man with spectacles and an air of perpetual excitement, greeted Walter and Margaret in a cluttered office overflowing with books and historical artifacts. "The Ericksons, thank you for coming so quickly," he said, clearing research materials from visitor chairs. "I've been analyzing those items you brought in, Walter, and, well," he paused, looking nervously between them. "Perhaps I should show you what I've found before explaining further." He led them to a secure room at the rear of the building, swiping a keycard to access what appeared to be a climate-controlled storage area. On a central examination table lay the metal containers Walter had discovered, now carefully opened, and their contents arranged methodically. "Military document cases, circa 1962, Abernathy explained, gesturing to the containers, "designed to protect contents from extreme conditions, but it's what's inside that's extraordinary." Margaret leaned closer, examining what appeared to be technical drawings, photographs, and classified documents bearing official seals and top-secret stamps that had faded with age. "These are technical specifications for a facility code-named Heartland Shield," Abernathy continued. "Based on my analysis, your farm sits directly above what appears to have been a hardened communications bunker constructed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not just any bunker, but what these documents describe as a presidential continuity of government installation." Walter furrowed his brow. "You're telling me there's some kind of presidential bunker under my farm? That can't be right. My father never mentioned anything like that, and he bought the property in 43. "That's what makes this so fascinating," Abernathy replied, his academic enthusiasm breaking through. "According to these documents, the facility was built in absolute secrecy in 1962, using an existing natural cave system. Even the property owner, your father, wasn't informed. The government established a classified easement through national security provisions. This document here," he pointed to an official-looking paper with multiple signatures, "indicates a perpetual security covenant on the subterranean facility regardless of surface ownership changes." Margaret, her legal mind racing, immediately grasped the implications. That would mean any development affecting the subsurface structure would require federal security clearance and approval. Abernathy finished, nodding vigorously, and potentially trigger historical preservation statutes given the facility's significance to Cold War history. So Reid can't build his utility, a corridor through the property, Walter concluded, hope creeping into his voice. Not legally, Margaret cautioned, but this explains the unauthorized soil testing and Reid's sudden urgency. Someone must have tipped him off about the facility's existence. He wants to secure control of the property before this information becomes officially known. Abernathy appeared uncomfortable. There's more. The facility wasn't merely abandoned after the Cold War like many such installations. According to final documents in the case, dated 1992, it was decommissioned but specifically left intact as a secondary continuity resource. The technical term they use is mothballed. Technically, it still falls under federal protection. Have you reported this to any authorities? Margaret asked. That's why I called you immediately, Abernathy replied. Given the classified nature of these materials, I'm obligated to notify the proper federal agencies. I submitted a secure information request to the National Archives and Department of Defense Historical Division last night. Their automated response indicated it could take up to 48 hours for initial review. Margaret examined one of the technical drawings more closely. These look like ventilation shafts extending to the surface. Have they been sealed? According to the decommissioning protocol, they were disguised but left functional for future contingency use, Abernathy explained. The primary access remained through the ridgeline entrance your father discovered, which was supposed to be concealed by controlled vegetation growth. As they continued examining the documents, Margaret's phone rang. The number displayed belonged to her law firm in Boston. "Sorry, I need to take this," she said, stepping away from the table. "My managing partner knows I'm handling a family emergency. He wouldn't call unless it was urgent." When Margaret returned minutes later, her expression had darkened considerably. "That was strange. My firm just received a call from someone claiming to represent Reid Development Group, asking if I'm formally representing my father in a potential real estate matter. When my partner said client relationships are confidential, the caller suggested that my involvement might constitute a conflict of interest with our firm's other clients. That's a pressure tactic, Walter observed. Reid's trying to cut off your legal support. It's more than that, Margaret replied. They've somehow learned I'm here helping you, which means they're monitoring our movements, and they're trying to intimidate my firm, which works with several large development companies on environmental compliance issues. Their conversation was interrupted when Abernathy's assistant knocked urgently on the door. "Dr. Abernathy." "There are some men here from the county assessor's office. They're asking to see any recent historical documentation regarding the Erickson property. They have what they claim is an official request form." Abernathy looked alarmed. "I never received any official notification." He turned to Margaret and Walter. "This isn't normal procedure. The county doesn't send officials in person for historical records. Don't let them in," Margaret said quietly. "Tell them all research materials require a formal written request and standard processing time. If they persist, ask for credentials and documentation of their authority to access archival materials." As Abernathy left to handle the visitors, Margaret quickly photographed several key documents with her phone. "We need copies of everything for protection. If Reid has influence with county officials, they might try to confiscate or restrict access to these records." Walter watched his daughter with growing concern. "Maggie, what exactly are we caught in the middle of here? This is starting to feel bigger than just a developer wanting my land." "I'm not sure," Margaret admitted, continuing to document the materials. "But the presence of a secret government facility, even a decommissioned one, under your property changes everything. If Reid knew about this before making his offers, He might be after more than just land for luxury homes. By the time Abernathy returned looking visibly shaken, Margaret had finished photographing the essential documents. "Those weren't county employees," he reported. "When I asked for formal credentials, they became evasive and left. My assistant noted their vehicle. Didn't have government plates despite their claims. Reid's people," Walter said grimly. "Testing how much we know." Margaret nodded. "Dr. Abernathy, I think you should expedite your contact with federal authorities. This situation is escalating faster than we anticipated. In the meantime, is there somewhere secure these materials can be stored, somewhere not obvious? I can move them to the university's special collections vault. I have research privileges there, and their security is considerably more robust than ours. Do it today, if possible," Margaret advised. "And be careful, you may be under observation." As they left the Historical Society through a rear entrance to avoid potential watchers, Margaret noticed a dark sedan parked across the street, its occupants suspiciously attentive to the building's main entrance. "We're definitely being monitored," she murmured to Walter as they walked briskly to her rental car. "We need to be careful what we say over phones or anywhere that might be overheard." Back at the farm, Margaret helped Walter into the house before conducting a careful examination of the property boundaries. The farm's isolation, once a source of peace for her father, now felt unnervingly exposed. From certain vantage points, she could see vehicles parked on adjacent development land, positioned with clear views of the farmhouse and main access roads. "They're not even trying to hide their surveillance anymore," she told Walter after completing her inspection. "There are at least 3 observation points set up around the property." Walter sank heavily into his favorite chair. "All this for a broken-down old farm? What does Reid really want with this land?" Margaret was formulating a response when her phone chimed with an incoming email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Regarding Heartland Shield Facility, urgent." With Walter watching anxiously, she opened the message. "Marcus Erickson. Your recent inquiries regarding certain historical infrastructure on the Pinewood Valley property have been flagged for national security review. As a courtesy, I'm reaching out unofficially before formal channels engage. The matter you're investigating intersects with sensitive historical security provisions that remain partially active. I strongly advise discretion regarding any documentation you may have encountered. I will be in your area tomorrow and request a confidential meeting to discuss options that would address your father's situation while respecting necessary security protocols. The wider circulation of certain historical information could trigger regulatory complications that would benefit neither your father's interests nor the community's development plans. This communication should be considered privileged and confidential. Regards, Thomas Harrington, Special Advisor, Office of Historical Infrastructure Security, Department of Defense. Margaret reread the email twice before showing it to her father. This could be legitimate, or it could be another pressure tactic using a spoofed government address. How would we know the difference? Walter asked. We wouldn't easily, Margaret admitted, but a real government representative wouldn't typically reach out unofficially via unsecured email about a matter involving national security. This reads more like someone trying to establish back-channel communication to keep the situation quiet. She began typing a careful response requesting official credentials and clarification of the sender's authority to discuss classified matters, but was interrupted by a notification of another incoming email, this one from Dr. Abernathy, Margaret, and Walter, 2 significant developments. I've secured the materials in the university's special collections vault under a research embargo that restricts access. I received a response from my National Archives inquiry much faster than expected. A senior archivist called personally to ask detailed questions about what specifically was discovered at your property. When I described the Heartland Shield designation, there was a noticeable shift in tone. I was asked to secure all materials immediately and told a specialized historical assessment team would make contact within 24 hours. The archivist emphasized this should be handled with appropriate historical sensitivity and that unauthorized development activity affecting the site should be documented and reported. Something about this situation has triggered high-level attention. Proceed with caution. Lawrence. As Margaret finished reading this message aloud, the distinctive sound of helicopters became audible in the distance, growing steadily louder. "That's not agricultural spraying," Walter said, moving to the window, with surprising agility despite his injured shoulder. "Those sound like military birds." Margaret joined him at the window as two black helicopters appeared over the tree line, circling the property once before hovering over the field adjacent to the ridge line where the bunker entrance had been discovered. "What now?" Walter murmured, watching as one helicopter began descending toward an improvised landing zone in his east pasture. Margaret's phone rang with an unknown Washington, D.C. number. She answered cautiously, keeping her eyes on the helicopters. "Ms. Erickson, this is Colonel James Westfield, Department of Defense Historical Infrastructure Division. We've received urgent notification regarding a sensitive historical site on your father's property. Our advance team is currently arriving on site for preliminary assessment. I'll be joining them within the hour. Could you and your father please remain at the residence until our team can establish appropriate security protocols?" Before Margaret could formulate a response, a fleet of black SUVs appeared on the access road leading to the farm, vehicles that looked remarkably similar to those used by Reid Development Group, but now bearing government license plates. The game had just changed dramatically, and the quiet farm that had been the subject of a local development dispute was suddenly the center of what appeared to be a high-priority federal operation. Whatever lay beneath Walter Erickson's land, it clearly held significance far beyond what either he or Margaret had imagined when examining those metal boxes in Dr. Abernathy's office just hours earlier. The first helicopter had fully landed in Walter's east pasture, its rotors still spinning as 4 uniformed personnel emerged and began establishing a secure perimeter. From the farmhouse window, Margaret and Walter watched as the second helicopter maintained a holding pattern overhead, seemingly monitoring the surrounding area. "This is real federal presence," Margaret said, her legal experience allowing her to recognize the methodical professionalism of the team's movements. "Not private security pretending to be officials." Walter's expression was a mixture of bewilderment and indignation. 6 decades I've worked this land, and now I find out the government's been keeping secrets underneath it the whole time. My father would never have agreed to this." "He might not have been given a choice," Margaret replied, recalling the documents they had seen. The national security provisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis granted extraordinary powers. Their observations were interrupted by a firm knock at the door. 2 individuals in dark suits stood on the porch, credentials already displayed. "Ms. Erickson, Mr. Erickson," the woman said crisply. "Agent Diana Chen, Department of Homeland Security, Historical Infrastructure Security Division. This is Agent Lawson. We're the Advanced Security Assessment Team. Colonel Westfield will be arriving shortly. May we come in?" Margaret examined their credentials carefully before allowing them inside, her attorney's instincts automatically documenting details of the engagement. "We understand the situation must be disconcerting," Agent Chen acknowledged once they were seated in the living room. "I want to assure you that our presence is not meant to infringe on your property rights, but to address a matter of historical infrastructure security that has recently been compromised." By compromised, you mean my father finding a bunker entrance on his own property that no one bothered to tell him was there? Margaret asked pointedly. Agent Chen nodded, unfazed by the challenge. Essentially, yes. The Heartland Shield facility was one of several continuity of government installations established during the early 1960s under classified protocols. Unlike many similar facilities that have been declassified and repurposed, this particular installation retained a contingency status designation that kept certain aspects of its existence restricted. What does that mean for my father's farm? Margaret pressed. There's a development company using aggressive tactics to acquire this property, potentially with knowledge of what's beneath it. The agents exchanged glances before Lawson responded. We're aware of Reid Development Group's interest in this property. Their activities have triggered several security monitoring protocols in recent weeks. You've been watching Reid? Walter asked. We monitor certain types of ground-penetrating radar and subsurface exploration activities near sensitive historical infrastructure, Chen explained. Reid Development's unauthorized geological surveys registered on our systems, but didn't immediately trigger intervention until the historical documentation was accessed through Dr. Abernathy's inquiries. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching rapidly. Through the window, Margaret could see Reid's now familiar black SUVs speeding toward the farmhouse, followed closely by county sheriff vehicles with lights flashing. It appears we have company, Agent Lawson observed calmly, touching his earpiece to communicate with the team outside. Mr. Reid seems determined to assert his influence. Our perimeter team will intercept, but this may become confrontational. Outside, the scene was developing quickly. Marcus Reid emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by attorneys and county officials. His confident stride faltered momentarily when he noticed the helicopter and uniformed personnel, but he recovered quickly and continued toward the house with determined purpose. The federal agents moved to the porch, positioning themselves as a barrier between Reid's group and the farmhouse entrance. Margaret and Walter followed, standing just inside the doorway where they could observe the confrontation. This property is currently under federal security assessment, Agent Chen announced formally as Reid approached. Access is restricted to authorized personnel only. Reid's expression darkened. This is a local matter involving county infrastructure planning and private development. Whatever federal interest you're claiming has no bearing on properly approved local governance decisions. He gestured to a man in an official county uniform. Sheriff Daniels has documentation authorizing preliminary utility corridor survey work authorized by County Ordinance 1587. Your interference constitutes obstruction of legitimate county business. The sheriff looked notably uncomfortable, especially when a second helicopter appeared on the horizon, this one larger and bearing distinct governmental markings. Your local authorizations are temporarily superseded by federal security protocols, Chen replied evenly. If you wish to pursue this matter, your attorneys can contact the Department of Justice Liaison Office for infrastructure security clearance procedures. Reid's face flushed with barely controlled anger. I've invested millions in development planning based on county-approved projections. Whatever historical curiosity you're investigating cannot retroactively override established development rights. My company has contractual obligations with timeline penalties that... He was interrupted by the arrival of the second helicopter, which settled onto the makeshift landing zone with practiced precision. The aircraft bore no civilian markings, instead displaying the distinctive dark green of military transport with subdued governmental insignia. As its rotors slowed, the side door opened to reveal several military personnel in formal dress uniforms, followed by a distinguished older man in a tailored suit. The atmosphere shifted palpably as the group approached, even Reid's attorneys straightening their postures in unconscious response to the clear authority they projected. Colonel James Westfield, announced the older man, displaying credentials. To the assembled group, Department of Defense, Historical Infrastructure Security Division. And this, he indicated a tall, silver-haired woman who stepped forward from the helicopter escort, is Director Catherine Sullivan of the National Continuity Programs Office. Margaret noticed Reid's complexion suddenly pale, his previous confidence evaporating as he recognized the woman. Director Sullivan studied Reid with cool assessment before turning to acknowledge Walter and Margaret with a respectful nod. "Mr. Erickson, Ms. Erickson," Sullivan said, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. "Thank you for your cooperation in this sensitive matter. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but the situation evolved rapidly once we received confirmation of exactly which facility had been compromised." She then turned her full attention to Reid, who had regained some composure but remained noticeably tense. "Mr. Reid, this is an unexpected context for our reunion." "Director Sullivan," Reid acknowledged stiffly, "my company's development plans have all necessary local approvals. Whatever historical interest the property holds can surely be addressed through reasonable accommodation during the development process." Sullivan's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps we should discuss your company's development plans more specifically, Mr. Reid, particularly your unauthorized ground-penetrating radar surveys and your sudden interest in subterranean rights, specifically along the ridgeline containing critical infrastructure access points." She turned to Colonel Westfield. "Colonel, please escort Mr. Reid to our mobile command center for a detailed discussion about classified infrastructure protocols and the penalties for attempting to access secured historical assets without proper clearance." As Reid was led away protesting about legitimate business interests and overreach of federal authority, Sullivan addressed Walter and Margaret directly. "Mr. Erickson, would you and your daughter join me inside? We have important matters to discuss regarding your property and its unique historical significance." Once seated in Walter's modest living room, Director Sullivan's formal demeanor softened slightly. "First, let me be clear. Your ownership of this land is not in question. The surface rights have always remained with the deed holder. What complicates matters is the classified subterranean easement established in 1962. An easement my father never agreed to," Walter noted. "Correct," Sullivan acknowledged. "During the Cuban Missile Crisis, certain national security provisions allowed for classified infrastructure development without standard disclosure. Your father was apparently selected because of his military service record and security clearance status from his work during World War II." Margaret leaned forward. "Are you saying my grandfather was chosen deliberately?" "According to our records, yes. Jacob Erickson's farm provided ideal geological conditions, while his personal background offered security advantages. He was approached for a different purpose, a soil conservation program that provided cover. For the initial surveys, the decision was made not to disclose the facility's true nature, even to him, but to rely on his established security clearance to reduce risk." Walter shook his head in disbelief. "So what happens now? Reid won't simply back down because federal agents showed up." "Mr. Reid's situation is more complicated than you realize," Sullivan replied with a hint of satisfaction. "His development company recently secured several government contracts for infrastructure projects in other states. Those contracts include security clearance requirements that he appears to have violated by authorizing intrusive surveys near a classified facility after receiving initial warning notifications." "You knew he was investigating the bunker?" Margaret asked. "We monitor certain types of activities near all sensitive historical infrastructure. Reid Development triggered automated security alerts 3 weeks ago with their ground-penetrating radar work. They received standard deterrence notifications, which they ignored. What elevates this beyond a simple security matter is evidence suggesting Mr. Reid was specifically targeting the facility, not simply planning normal development. Sullivan removed a tablet from her briefcase and displayed a series of emails and documents. These were obtained through a national security warrant after the initial violation. They strongly suggest Mr. Reid was working with a foreign investment group, particularly interested in acquiring properties with historical security significance. Margaret reviewed the documents with growing alarm. He was knowingly trying to gain control of a former government facility for foreign interests. That's potentially treasonous, Sullivan finished calmly, though proving criminal intent rather than merely unethical business practice is challenging. What's certain is that his security clearance for government contracts will be revoked pending full investigation. Walter leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. So my farm is safe from his development plans. More than safe, Mr. Erickson, Sullivan replied with the first genuine smile they'd seen. Your property has now been formally recognized under the Historical Infrastructure Preservation Program. This designation provides substantial tax benefits and conservation incentives while ensuring the historical significance of the site remains protected. She handed Walter an official folder. This contains the formal designation documents, along with information about available support programs, including agricultural heritage grants that many participants use to modernize their operations while maintaining historical integrity. Walter examined the documents with cautious optimism. This would let me keep farming with considerably more resources at your disposal, Sullivan confirmed. The program includes technical assistance, equipment modernization grants, and operational support specifically designed for properties with historical infrastructure significance. Many participants find they can transition to more sustainable and less physically demanding agricultural models while preserving their family legacy. Margaret, reviewing the legal aspects of the documents, looked up in surprise. These benefits are substantial. Why offer so much? Because properties like your father's serve multiple national interests, Sullivan explained. They maintain essential historical infrastructure access, preserve agricultural heritage, and provide environmental buffer zones around sensitive sites. The program recognizes that private stewards like your father are far more effective than government management could ever be. The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Westfield's return. He spoke quietly to Sullivan, who nodded with satisfaction before addressing Walter and Margaret again. It appears Mr. Reid has had a change of perspective regarding his development plans. After reviewing the evidence of his company's activities and the potential implications for his government contracts, he has agreed to withdraw all claims and interest in adjacent properties. The county officials have also been reminded of federal preemption in matters involving historical security infrastructure. Walter's expression remained skeptical. And we're just supposed to trust that he'll back off permanently? Men like Reid don't surrender easily. Men like Reid understand leverage, Sullivan replied. His company's financial stability depends on government contracts that require security clearance. That clearance now hangs by a thread, contingent on his full cooperation. Additionally, we've implemented enhanced monitoring protocols for all properties surrounding this historical site. She rose to leave, extending her hand to Walter. Mr. Erickson, your family has unknowingly helped safeguard an important piece of American history for generations. We would be honored to have your continued participation through the preservation program, but the choice remains entirely yours. The documents include contact information for my office should you have questions about any aspect of the program. As Sullivan and her team prepared to depart, Margaret walked with them to the waiting helicopter. There's one thing that doesn't make sense, she said privately to Sullivan. The response to this situation seems disproportionate. Helicopters, high-level officials, immediate intervention. What aren't you telling us about what's underneath my father's farm? Sullivan studied Margaret thoughtfully before responding. The Heartland Shield facility was unique among Cold War installations. Most were eventually decommissioned completely or repurposed. This one remained designated as a contingency resource because it contained something that couldn't be easily relocated, a direct hardline communication system to similar facilities that remains functional despite being technologically outdated. In crisis planning, redundancy often depends on technologies too basic to be vulnerable to modern disruptions. So there's still active government equipment under the farm. Active would be an overstatement, Sullivan clarified. Perhaps preserved is more accurate. Think of it as a historical resource that retains potential utility in extremely unlikely scenarios. Your father's continued stewardship helps maintain an unobtrusive security presence while preserving agricultural land that might otherwise be lost to development. As Margaret watched the helicopters depart, Walter joined her in the pasture, gazing across the farm that had been his life's work and nearly slipped from his control. "Never thought I'd be grateful for a secret government bunker under my property," he remarked wryly, "though I'm still not sure I believe everything they've told us." "I suspect that's by design," Margaret replied, "but whatever the full truth might be, the farm is secure now. The preservation program will provide resources to make operations more sustainable, and Reid's development plans have been decisively blocked." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed his land with new understanding. "Your mother always said this place was special, that it had a purpose beyond what we could see. Thought she was just being sentimental about the family connection. Turns out there was more truth to it than either of us knew." 2 weeks later, Walter sat on his porch, watching as agricultural consultants from the preservation program surveyed his fields, recommending modernizations that would reduce physical strain while maintaining the farm's historical character. Margaret worked nearby on her laptop, having extended her stay to help establish the new operational framework. The development that had threatened to surround the farm had halted abruptly following Reid's legal troubles. County records now showed a conservation buffer zone established around Pinewood Valley Farm, ensuring its agricultural heritage would continue uninterrupted. What the public records didn't show, and what Walter and Margaret had agreed to maintain as confidential, was the true nature of what lay beneath the rolling fields where generations of Ericksons had grown crops and raised livestock. The ridgeline entrance had been professionally secured with a disguised access point that blended seamlessly into the landscape, accessible only to authorized personnel who now visited annually for routine maintenance. As evening fell across the farm, Walter watched a solitary hawk circling overhead, the same view his father and grandfather had enjoyed from this porch. The land remained, its surface continuing to produce the crops that had sustained his family for generations, while beneath it lay secrets that had unexpectedly ensured its preservation for generations to come. The black SUVs that had once signaled threats of development and displacement had been replaced by the occasional unmarked government vehicle conducting discreet security assessments. The presidential helicopter that had caused Marcus Reid to pale with recognition had departed, but had left behind protection more powerful than Walter could have imagined when he stubbornly refused that first buyout offer months ago. The irony is that if he'd approached this differently, if he'd been honest about his development plans and worked within proper channels, he might have achieved at least some of his goals, Margaret observed. His determination to force the issue through intimidation and manipulation is what triggered the security monitoring in the first place. "That's often how these situations unfold," Chen replied. Legitimate development near sensitive sites follows established protocols. It's the attempts to circumvent those protocols that draw attention. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Walter, who climbed the porch steps with the steady gait of someone who had found renewed strength in purpose. "Those young people ask better questions than most agricultural experts I've met," he declared with evident satisfaction. "Actually think about why things work instead of just following procedures blindly." "That's because they have an exceptional teacher," Margaret replied, pouring her father a glass of iced tea from the pitcher. On the small table between the rocking chairs, Walter accepted the drink with a nod of thanks before turning to Chen. "Any news on when those solar panels will be approved? The Preservation Grant Administrator mentioned something about special considerations for historical properties." "The review is proceeding well," Chen confirmed. "Because of the site's significance, there are additional aesthetic and security requirements, but Director Sullivan has personally endorsed the sustainability upgrades. The historical value actually works in your favor here. The program prioritizes making heritage sites energy independent." This transformation in Walter's perspective had been perhaps the most remarkable change of the past 6 months. The man, who had once resisted any alteration to his traditional farming methods, now enthusiastically embraced sustainable innovations, particularly those that aligned with his deepening understanding of his role as a steward of both the land and its hidden history. After Chen departed, Walter and Margaret walked together along the ridgeline path that had become their evening ritual. The setting sun cast long shadows across fields, now divided into research plots where traditional crops grew alongside experimental varieties selected for climate resilience. "Still can't believe how things turned out," Walter reflected, pausing, at the spot where storm erosion had first revealed the bunker entrance. All those years fighting to keep this place, never knowing what was really worth protecting. Margaret understood his meaning. While the farm itself remained his primary passion, Walter had developed a certain pride in his unexpected role as guardian of a historical site that had played a part in one of America's most tense historical moments. The Cold War infrastructure beneath his fields had connected him to a broader historical narrative that gave additional meaning to his family's multi-generational stewardship. "Mom would have loved this story," Margaret said, mentioning her mother in a way that had become easier in recent months. "She always said this land had secrets worth keeping." Walter smiled at the memory. "Helen had more intuition than I ever gave her credit for. Always said she could feel something special about the ridge." He paused, looking across the land, illuminated by the golden hour light. "Sometimes I wonder if she knew more than she let on." This possibility had occurred to Margaret as well, particularly after discovering additional documents in the Historical Society archives, suggesting that certain local residents had been discreetly included in security awareness protocols. During the facility's active years, her mother's family had deep roots in county government, potentially positioning her for such inclusion. As they continued their walk, Margaret noticed a dark sedan turning onto the farm's access road, a vehicle she recognized as belonging to Dr. Abernathy from the Historical Society. The historian had become a regular visitor, documenting the farm's surface history as a cover for the classified research he was now authorized to conduct on the Heartland Shield facility. "Lawrence is back," she observed. "Must have found something new in those archives." Walter nodded with interest. "He promised to bring those declassified photographs of the construction. Said there might be pictures of my father in them, though he wouldn't have known what was really being built." The historian's passion for documenting the Cold War era had found perfect application in the carefully controlled disclosure process now underway. While the facility's core purpose and capabilities remained classified, aspects of its historical Significance were being prepared for eventual public recognition through carefully vetted exhibits at the County Historical Museum. Sometimes, Walter reflected as he watched the consultants complete their survey, the most valuable things remain hidden until the moment when revealing them becomes necessary. The secret beneath his farm had waited patiently for decades, emerging precisely when needed to preserve not just the land, but the legacy his family had built upon it. Before we end today's story, let me know in the comments if you've ever discovered something unexpected that changed everything when it seemed like all hope was lost. And don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's incredible story about an abandoned house that revealed a fortune that no one could legally claim until a forgotten letter changed everything. 6 months after the dramatic confrontation that had transformed the fate of Pinewood Valley Farm, the property stood as an island of thriving agricultural heritage amid changing landscapes. The summer heat had given way to autumn's crisp embrace, painting the ridgeline with brilliant reds and golds that complemented the golden fields ready for harvest. For the first time in years, Walter Erickson wasn't facing the season alone. The Historical Infrastructure Preservation Program had delivered on its promises, providing resources that had revolutionized operations while preserving the farm's essential character. Modern equipment adapted for an aging farmer's needs had replaced the troublesome tractor that had sent Walter to the hospital. Sustainable farming consultants had introduced techniques that reduced physical strain while enhancing soil health. Most significantly, the program had funded apprenticeships that brought young agricultural students to learn from Walter's lifetime of experience. From the renovated farmhouse porch, Margaret watched her father demonstrating proper seed selection to 3 university students who listened with rapt attention. At 80, Walter stood straighter now, his injured shoulder fully healed and his movements more confident with the knowledge that his legacy would continue beyond his years. "Never thought I'd see your father teaching," remarked Diana Chen, the Department of Homeland Security agent who had become the farm's regular security liaison. Now dressed in casual attire rather than the formal suit of their first meeting, she had stopped by for what was ostensibly a routine security assessment, but had evolved into something more like a friendly visit. "He's found a new purpose," Margaret agreed. "Teaching gives him a reason to keep going that doesn't depend solely on his physical abilities. The students respect his knowledge, and he respects their fresh perspectives. It's a partnership that benefits everyone." Chen nodded appreciatively. The preservation program has rarely seen such successful integration. Most historical infrastructure sites maintain minimal public engagement, but Director Sullivan was right about your father. He's the perfect steward, protective of the land while embracing its new purpose. What neither woman mentioned directly was the real reason for Chen's regular visits, the continued monitoring of the classified facility beneath the farm. Every 3 months, specialized technical teams arrived in unmarked vans to perform maintenance on the underground systems, their work conducted discreetly through the secured ridgeline entrance that now appeared to be nothing more than a reinforced storm cellar. Walter had adapted to this unusual arrangement with surprising ease, incorporating the security protocols into his daily routines and developing a cordial relationship with the rotating teams of government personnel. His only stipulation had been full transparency with Margaret about all activities on the property, a condition Director Sullivan had personally approved, recognizing that family continuity was essential for the farm's long-term stability. "Have you heard anything about Reid lately?" Margaret asked, changing the subject as Walter's lesson concluded and the students moved toward the equipment barn for the practical portion of their training. Chen's expression tightened slightly. "His legal situation continues to evolve, though, not in his favor. The investigation expanded beyond the initial security clearance violations into his company's financing structures. They've discovered concerning patterns of international investment in several projects near sensitive infrastructure. The Pinewood Valley situation appears to have been part of a larger pattern. Margaret wasn't entirely surprised. In the months following the confrontation, she had leveraged her legal expertise to research Reid Development Group's activities throughout the region, identifying suspicious patterns that aligned with Chen's assessment. What had initially seemed like aggressive but ordinary development pressure had revealed itself as something potentially more sinister, a systematic attempt to gain control of properties with strategic or historical significance. This balanced approach, maintaining security while acknowledging history, typified the thoughtful resolution that had transformed a threatening situation into an opportunity for preservation and growth. What Reid had attempted to exploit through coercion, the preservation program had embraced as worth protecting, providing resources rather than making demands. Inside the farmhouse, now comfortably modernized with preservation grant funding, Margaret checked her email while Walter welcomed Abernathy. Her legal practice had evolved along with her father's farm, her expertise in environmental conservation, now supplemented by a growing specialty in historical preservation law. She currently split her time between Boston and the farm, having arranged a flexible schedule that allowed her to maintain her career while supporting her father's new ventures. Among the day's messages was a notification from the county records office confirming a significant development, the formal establishment of an agricultural heritage district encompassing Pinewood Valley Farm and surrounding properties. This designation, which Margaret had helped negotiate through her legal connections, provided additional protections against future development pressure while creating tax incentives for maintaining agricultural use. More personally meaningful was an email from the apprenticeship program coordinator confirming that Jason Reeves, one of Walter's most dedicated students, had been approved for the extended residency position. This meant the young farmer would live on the property for a full growing season, learning Walter's methods while bringing modern sustainable practices to the operation. "Good news?" Walter asked, noticing Margaret's smile as he entered with Abernathy. "Jason's residency was approved," she confirmed. "He can move into the renovated guest cottage next month and stay through next year's harvest." Walter's expression brightened noticeably. The former high school agriculture teacher had shown exceptional promise and genuine appreciation for Walter's traditional knowledge. More importantly, he had demonstrated respect for the land's history and significance, qualities that made him an ideal candidate for potential long-term involvement with the farm. "Perfect timing," Walter declared. "There's so much to teach him before spring planting, and with his engineering background, he'll understand the technical aspects of the solar installation and irrigation modernization." As Abernathy spread his newly discovered historical photographs across the kitchen table, the three engaged in a conversation that bridged past and future, analyzing images from the height of Cold War tension while discussing sustainability, innovations that would carry the farm forward for generations to come. One photograph particularly captured their attention. A 1962 image showing Jacob Erickson, Walter's father, standing beside government officials at what appeared to be an agricultural award ceremony. What only those with security clearance would recognize was that the Soil Conservation Award being presented was actually a cover for Jacob's silent participation in allowing the secret facility to be constructed beneath his property. "He never mentioned any of this," Walter said, studying his father's face in the grainy image. "Not a word about government projects or special recognitions." "He wouldn't have been permitted to," Abernathy explained gently. "The security protocols were absolute. But according to these newly declassified memos, he was considered an essential partner in the project, one of very few civilians trusted with even peripheral awareness of critical infrastructure placement. Walter traced his finger along the edge of the photograph. All these years I thought I knew everything about this land. Turns out it was keeping secrets right under my feet. Some secrets protect rather than harm, Margaret observed. This one saved your farm when nothing else could have stopped Reid's development plans. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that the very government intervention Walter had resisted throughout his independent farming career had ultimately preserved that independence when it was most threatened. The classified facility that had been hidden from the Erickson family for generations had emerged at precisely the moment it was needed most. 1 month later, on a crisp November morning, Walter stood with Margaret at the farm's main gate, watching, as new signs were installed by the preservation program's maintenance team. The traditional Pinewood Valley Farm, Esther 1943 sign remained, but was now accompanied by a discreet bronze plaque designating the property as part of the National Agricultural Heritage Network, a public-facing recognition that revealed nothing of the classified designation that provided the farm's true protection. "Official at last," Walter remarked with satisfaction. "Your mother would have loved seeing her family name preserved this way." Margaret nodded, thinking of how dramatically their situation had changed from the desperate days when Reid's threats had seemed unstoppable. It's still hard to believe sometimes that discovering a government secret actually saved everything instead of complicating it further. "Life's full of unexpected turns," Walter philosophized. 6 months ago, I was fighting just to hold on to land that was slowly becoming too much for me to manage alone. Now we've got resources, support, and a future beyond what I could have imagined. As if emphasizing his point, a university van arrived carrying students for the day's scheduled workshop on heritage seed preservation, one of the educational programs now regularly hosted at the farm as part of its new role as a teaching facility. Walter straightened his posture, the veteran farmer preparing to share knowledge accumulated over decades of working the land. "Better get to it," he said, with renewed energy. Got a full day of teaching ahead. As he walked toward the waiting students, his stride displayed none of the weariness that had marked him during Margaret's initial return. The burden of solitary struggle had been replaced by the energizing purpose of legacy building. Not merely preserving the past, but actively shaping how his lifetime of knowledge would serve future generations. Margaret watched her father with a sense of resolution that transcended the legal victory they had achieved. Beyond stopping Reid's development plans, beyond securing the farm's future, they had discovered something more valuable. A new chapter for both the land and the family, connected to it for generations. The presidential helicopter that had caused Marcus Reid to panic had long since departed, but its impact remained in the transformed landscape of possibilities that now stretched before Pinewood Valley Farm. The story of the elderly farmer threatened by development had evolved into something larger, a testament to how sometimes the most valuable legacy isn't what shows on the surface, but what remains hidden until the moment when its revelation changes everything. If you enjoyed this incredible true story about how an elderly farmer's discovery changed everything, make sure you're subscribed to catch tomorrow's video about a forgotten time capsule that reunited long-lost siblings after 50 years apart. Let me know in the comments if you believe some things happen exactly when they're meant to, and don't forget to share this video with someone who appreciates stories about justice and unexpected second chances. 1 year to the day after the presidential helicopter had landed in Walter Erickson's East Pasture, the Pinewood Valley Farm hosted its first official Heritage Harvest Festival. What had begun as a small celebration for the farm's new direction had expanded into a community event when neighboring properties expressed interest in participating. Now, nearly 500 visitors wandered through demonstration areas where traditional farming techniques were showcased alongside innovative sustainable practices. Margaret surveyed the scene from the ridgeline overlook, marveling at the transformation. Educational booths staffed by university agriculture students explained crop rotation methods pioneered by the Erickson family decades ago. The equipment barn, once a repository of aging machinery Walter could no longer safely operate, had been converted to a museum space displaying both agricultural history and carefully selected exhibits about the region's Cold War significance. Exhibits that revealed nothing about what specifically lay beneath the rolling fields. "Your father seems to be enjoying his celebrity status," observed Catherine Sullivan, who had arrived without fanfare in an unmarked government sedan rather than the dramatic helicopter of her first visit. Now dressed in casual attire that helped her blend with the festival crowd, the director of national continuity programs looked more like a weekend visitor than a high-ranking government official. "He's found his element," Margaret agreed, watching Walter holding court with a group of fascinated visitors as he demonstrated traditional seed-sorting techniques. Teaching comes naturally to him, though he would never have admitted it a year ago. They walked together along the path that followed the ridgeline, maintaining a respectful distance from the secured facility entrance that remained invisible to casual observers. The autumn colors painted the landscape in brilliant hues, nature's celebration of the harvest season complementing the human festivities below. "The Heartland Shield Project has become something of a case study within our department," Sullivan remarked, after ensuring they were beyond earshot of other visitors. "Most historical infrastructure sites remain purely technical assets, maintained but disconnected from community engagement. This integration of security protocols with public education and agricultural preservation has created a model we're considering implementing at other locations." Margaret wasn't entirely surprised. Over the past year, the farm had hosted not only agricultural students, but also discreet visits from government officials who seemed more interested in observing the operational model than in the facility itself. The balance struck between security requirements and public benefit had clearly impressed those responsible for similar sites elsewhere. "It helps that my father genuinely believes in both missions now," Margaret replied. "Preserving agricultural heritage and protecting historical infrastructure have become intertwined purposes for him. Each gives meaning to the other." Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "That alignment of purpose is what makes this arrangement so effective. Your father's commitment to the land transcends the specific reason for its protection. The why matters less than the fact of preservation itself." As they rounded a bend in the path, they encountered Jason Reeves, the young agricultural engineer whose residency at the farm had evolved into a permanent position. Now officially, the assistant farm manager, Jason, had proven himself not merely a student of Walter's traditional knowledge, but a bridge between generations, respecting historical practices while implementing sustainable innovations that reduce the operation's environmental impact. "Director Sullivan," Jason greeted her with the casual respect of someone who had interacted with government officials frequently enough to be comfortable in their presence. "We've just activated the new monitoring system for the heritage seed vault. The climate control is maintaining optimal preservation conditions while using 40% less energy than projected. This seed vault, a secure underground storage facility housing heirloom and endangered crop varieties, had been established as part of the farm's educational mission. What visitors didn't know was that its advanced security and climate control systems shared infrastructure with the classified facility, creating efficiencies that benefited both operations. Excellent progress, Sullivan acknowledged. The integration of preservation technologies with sustainable energy systems has significant implications for similar projects. After Jason continued on his way to manage the festival's demonstration schedule, Sullivan turned to Margaret with a more personal observation. Your father and young Mr. Reeves have developed quite a productive partnership. One might almost see a father-son dynamic emerging. Margaret smiled, having noticed the same evolution. Jason fills a role that I never could, despite my efforts. To help with the farm, he shares Dad's connection to the land in a way that I appreciate but don't fully experience myself. And Dad gets to mentor someone who genuinely wants to carry forward both the practical knowledge and the values that shaped this place. As they rejoined the festival activities, Margaret's attention was drawn to an unexpected arrival, a sleek town car with government plates pulling into the designated VIP parking area. From it emerged an elderly man she didn't recognize, accompanied by what appeared to be medical assistance personnel and security. Sullivan followed her gaze, and her expression changed subtly. He should have mentioned there would be one additional official visitor today. Former Senator Howard Chambers served on the original oversight committee for the Heartland Shield project. At 92, he expressed a particular interest in seeing how the site has evolved before his health makes travel impossible. The name registered immediately with Margaret. Howard Chambers had been a political powerhouse in the region during the Cold War era, serving 6 terms in the Senate and chairing multiple committees related to national security. His arrival at what was ostensibly a small agricultural festival suggested the site held particular significance in the government's historical consciousness. As festival staff directed the elderly statesman toward the main event area, Sullivan excused herself to make proper introductions. Margaret watched from a distance as Walter was summoned to meet the distinguished visitor. Curious about what connection might exist between her father's family and this political figure from decades past. The interaction that followed surprised her. Rather than the formal exchange of pleasantries she expected, the meeting between Walter and the former senator appeared immediately warm and familiar. Despite the significant age difference, the two men embraced like old acquaintances, engaging in animated conversation that suggested shared memories rather than a first introduction. When Margaret made her way to the refreshment tent where they had settled, she arrived in time to hear a fragment of conversation that caught her completely by surprise. "Never would have recognized you after all these years," the former senator was saying. "You were just a boy when I last visited your father here, but you have his exact expressions. He would be proud to see what you've maintained." Walter's response revealed equal familiarity. "I remember you visiting, though I didn't understand the significance then. Dad always spoke highly of your support during those challenging years." Noticing Margaret's arrival, Walter beckoned her closer. "Senator Chambers, this is my daughter Margaret. She's the real reason this place survived. Fought off that developer with legal maneuvers I couldn't have managed alone." The elderly statesman studied Margaret with keen intelligence that belied his advanced age. "Miss Erickson, it's a privilege to meet you. Your grandfather Jacob was one of the finest men I ever worked with, a true patriot who understood that sometimes serving one's country happens in quiet ways that history never properly recognizes." Margaret took the offered hand, processing this unexpected connection. "You knew my grandfather personally?" "Quite well," Chambers confirmed. "I was the junior senator assigned to the special committee that selected this location in '61. Your grandfather was the only civilian who intuitively understood the delicate balance we were trying to achieve, creating essential security infrastructure without destroying the agricultural character that made this region special." This revelation shifted Margaret's understanding of her family history significantly. My father always believed Grandpa Jacob had no knowledge of what was built beneath this farm. Senator Chambers exchanged glances with Director Sullivan before responding carefully. The official records maintained that position for obvious security reasons. The reality was more nuanced. Your grandfather was never briefed on technical specifications or capabilities, but he was made aware of the general purpose and critical importance of what we were establishing here. Walter leaned forward, his expression reflecting a lifetime of unanswered questions. Why didn't he ever tell me? Because he understood the burden of certain knowledge, Chambers replied gently. Jacob believed your connection to this land should be based on its agricultural value and family legacy, not colored by security obligations. He made us promise that you would be permitted to farm normally, without the weight of classified knowledge, shaping your relationship with the property. This explanation resonated with both Walter and Margaret, aligning with what they knew of Jacob Erickson's character, a man who had survived the Great Depression and served in World War II before, establishing the family farm with a fierce independence that had carried through generations. There's something else you should know, Chambers continued, removing a small leather portfolio from his jacket. When I learned this property had been formally incorporated into the Historical Infrastructure Preservation Program, I requested permission to share certain limited historical materials from my personal records. This photograph was taken the day we finalized arrangements with your grandfather. He handed Walter a black and white image showing Jacob Erickson standing beside a significantly younger Howard Chambers and several military officials. They were positioned on the exact ridgeline where Walter and Margaret now regularly walked, the landscape behind them recognizable despite 6 decades of changes. That day, your grandfather said something I've never forgotten, Chambers recalled. He told us, what you're building underground will protect the nation in crisis, but what I'm maintaining above ground will feed the nation every day. Both matter equally. That philosophy shaped how we approached the entire project, with respect for the land and its primary purpose. Walter studied the photograph with evident emotion, seeing his father through new eyes, not merely as the hard-working farmer he had known, but as someone who had made conscious choices about what legacy to emphasize and what secrets to shelter. Future generations from? He never told my mother either, Walter asked. No, Chambers confirmed, though I suspect she intuited more than was ever explicitly shared. Helen had remarkable perception. This casual mention of Walter's late wife by name startled both Walter and Margaret. The senator recognized their reaction and smiled apologetically. Forgive me. In my position, one becomes accustomed to knowing details about families connected to significant sites. Your wife's background in local government made her particularly valuable to the community during certain critical periods, though she never knew exactly why some of the civil defense preparations she helped implement were located where they were. The festival continued around them as this private conversation reshaped the Erickson family's understanding of their own history. What had appeared to be simply a generational farming operation had simultaneously been a carefully maintained security asset, with family members contributing knowingly or unknowingly to both missions across decades. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the official visitors departed and the festival began winding down. Local families lingered to enjoy the traditional harvest dinner served from long tables near the renovated barn. Walter, having completed his formal responsibilities, found a quiet moment with Margaret at their favorite spot overlooking the eastern fields. All those years I thought I was fighting alone to preserve this place, he reflected. Turns out we've had silent partners for generations. Margaret nodded, still processing the revelations of the day. Does it change how you feel about the farm, knowing it wasn't just agricultural tradition, but also national security that shaped its history? Walter considered the question carefully before responding. It changes the story, but not the meaning. This land has always been about protection, whether it's protecting food production, family legacy, or national security. The purpose remains constant, even if the specific reasons evolved. As twilight settled over Pinewood Valley Farm, the heritage, lanterns placed along pathways illuminated visitors making their way to parking areas. The festival had succeeded beyond expectations, establishing new connections between the historical farm and the surrounding community, while carefully preserving the necessary security protocols for what remained beneath the surface. Marcus Reid's threats against an elderly farmer had unintentionally triggered a sequence of events that revealed deeper meanings and connections than anyone could have anticipated. The presidential helicopter's arrival had marked not an ending, but a new beginning, one that honored the past while creating sustainable pathways toward the future. Walter Erickson, once the last farmer standing against development pressure, now stood at the center of an expanding circle of agricultural education, historical preservation, and quiet service to purposes that transcended personal ownership. The black SUVs that had once brought threats of displacement had been replaced by vehicles bringing students, visitors, and occasionally government officials who understood the unique value of what generations of Ericksons had maintained. As Walter and Margaret walked back toward the farmhouse that evening, passing Jason as he secured the educational displays for the night, 3 generations of stewardship converged in a moment that bridged past, present, and future, each caring for the land in their own way while respecting the multiple layers of significance it had accumulated through decades of history, both visible and hidden. Don't forget to subscribe to catch tomorrow's incredible story about a forgotten small-town hero whose one decision in 1952 saved hundreds of lives but remained unknown until a school project revealed the truth 70 years later. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment sharing what surprised you most about today's revelation. Your engagement helps us bring more amazing true stories like this one to light. 5 years had passed since the day Marcus Reid's black SUVs had surrounded Walter Erickson's farmhouse with threats of imminent development. On a crisp autumn morning, as golden light bathed the ridgeline in warm hues, a small group gathered at the oak tree by the creek, where Walter's wife, Helen, had been laid to rest decades earlier. Walter himself, now 85, sat in a wheelchair positioned carefully on the flat ground beside the memorial stone, Margaret standing supportively behind him. The occasion was bittersweet, the official dedication of the Erickson Family Agricultural Research Center, a state-of-the-art facility constructed on a previously underutilized section of the farm. The modern building, with its living roof of native grasses and solar array, blended remarkably well into the landscape, its design incorporating architectural elements that echoed the original farmhouse while serving thoroughly modern purposes. My father would have been speechless, Margaret addressed the assembled group, which included university officials, government representatives, and community members. 5 years ago, he was fighting simply to keep this land from being carved up for development. Today we're establishing a research center that will ensure his agricultural knowledge and this land's heritage continue benefiting future generations. Walter nodded in agreement, his weathered face creased with the satisfied smile of someone who had lived to see his life's work not merely preserved, but elevated beyond what he could have imagined. Though his health had declined gradually over the past year, his mind remained sharp, and he continued to serve as the guiding voice for the farm's educational initiatives. Jason Reeves, now the farm's full manager and director of agricultural operations, stood nearby with his wife and their young son, whom they had named Jacob in honor of Walter's father. The family lived in the renovated farmhouse, maintaining the continuity of presence that had defined Pinewood Valley Farm since 1943. Under Jason's leadership, the farm had evolved into a renowned center for sustainable agriculture research while maintaining working production fields that demonstrated heritage techniques alongside innovative practices. The dedication ceremony carried special significance not just for what was being established, but for what had been averted. The surrounding landscape that had once been threatened by Reid Development's aggressive expansion now formed part of the Riverdale Agricultural Heritage District, a protected zone established through collaboration between the historical infrastructure, preservation program and local conservation initiatives. Instead of luxury housing developments, the rolling hills continued producing crops and supporting research that addressed emerging challenges in food security and climate adaptation. Following the formal dedication and ribbon cutting for the new research center, a smaller gathering convened inside the facility's conference room. Here, beneath a portrait of Jacob Erickson that had been enhanced and restored from the historical photograph Senator Chambers had shared years earlier, Director Catherine Sullivan addressed the limited audience that possessed security clearance for the day's second, more private recognition. Today marks not only the dedication of an agricultural research facility, but the 5th anniversary of Pinewood Valley Farm's formal incorporation into the National Historical Infrastructure Network, Sullivan noted. What began as an emergency intervention to protect a critical historical site has evolved into our program's most successful integration of security requirements with public benefit. On the conference table lay a leather-bound volume embossed with both the Department of Defense seal and the Erickson family crest that Margaret had commissioned after learning of her grandfather's conscious participation in the Heartland Shield project. The book contained authorized historical documentation of the farm's dual legacy, carefully selected materials that revealed the family's multi-generational stewardship without disclosing technical details that remained classified. This commemorative record will be housed in the National Archives as testimony to how private citizenship and national service can converge in unexpected ways, Sullivan continued. The Erickson family's story represents the quiet patriotism that has sustained this nation through its most challenging periods, ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things without recognition or acknowledgement. Walter listened with quiet dignity, his gnarled farmer's hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. Though he had never sought recognition beyond the borders of his fields, he had come to appreciate how his family's story connected to larger historical currents. The knowledge that his father had made conscious choices about the property's dual purpose had transformed his understanding of his own life's work from simple agricultural persistence to something that transcended individual effort. After the gathering dispersed, Margaret accompanied her father back to his private residence, a single-story, accessible home constructed adjacent to the main farmhouse when Walter's mobility had begun to decline. The space had been designed to maintain his independence while providing necessary accommodations for aging, allowing him to remain on the property he had fought to preserve. "They certainly make a fuss these days," Walter remarked as Margaret helped him settle into his favorite chair overlooking the eastern fields. "All these ceremonies and recognitions. Your grandfather just farmed the land and kept his secrets without anyone making speeches about it." Margaret smiled at her father's characteristic modesty. "Different times require different approaches. The educational component matters now, sharing the knowledge you've accumulated rather than just preserving it." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Jason's doing well with that part. Has a teacher's instinct I never possessed. Knows how to explain things so they make sense to people who didn't grow up working the land." "He learned from the best," Margaret replied, adjusting the throw blanket across her father's lap. "You gave him the foundation that makes his innovations possible." Their conversation paused as Walter's attention was drawn to movement along the ridgeline path, a small group of visitors being guided by one of the farm's educational staff. Even from a distance, the distinctive formal attire of several participants suggested another governmental delegation studying the Pinewood Valley model for potential application elsewhere. Such visits had become routine over the years as the farm's dual success in agricultural innovation and historical preservation attracted attention from multiple agencies and international delegations. What had begun as a security necessity had evolved into a template for projects worldwide, where historical infrastructure and public benefit could be integrated rather than isolated from each other. Sometimes I still can't believe how it all turned out, Walter mused, watching the distant figures pause at one of the educational markers along the ridge. If that storm hadn't exposed the bunker entrance, if you hadn't come back when you did, if Director Sullivan hadn't been on that helicopter, a lot of things had to align, Margaret agreed, thinking of the chain of seemingly coincidental events that had transformed potential disaster into unprecedented opportunity. But I think Grandpa Jacob created the foundation for all of it with the choices he made back in 1962. He understood something about stewardship that went beyond just maintaining property. Walter's gaze drifted to the photograph of his father that occupied a place of honor on his bookshelf, the formal portrait from his military service days, rather than the candid image with Senator Chambers that had revealed so much about the family's hidden history. Dad never talked much about his service during the war, Walter reflected. Always said farming was his way of continuing to serve after he came home. I didn't understand what he meant until these past few years. The sigh. Land was never just about crops. It was about providing something essential, whether that was food or security. As evening approached, Jason arrived with his 5-year-old son in tow, continuing the daily ritual that had become precious to Walter. Time with the boy who represented the future of Pinewood Valley Farm. Though not biologically related, young, Jacob had inherited the Erickson legacy through the deliberate continuity Walter and Margaret had established when it became clear Walter's health would eventually limit his active participation. "Mr. Erickson," the boy called excitedly, carefully carrying a jar containing his latest discovery from the fields. "I found a special rock by the creek. It has tiny fossils inside." Walter examined the specimen with exaggerated seriousness as the child climbed onto the chair beside him. "That's limestone with marine fossils," he explained. "Millions of years ago, this whole area was under an ancient sea. The creatures in that rock lived long before any people farmed this land." The boy's eyes widened at this geological perspective. Even before Grandpa Jacob, the adult smiled at this compression of historical time, but Walter nodded with equal seriousness. "Even before him, the land remembers things that happened long before our family came here. That's why we have to take good care of it. We're just borrowing it for a little while." This philosophy of stewardship had become the central ethos of the educational programs now operating from the farm. The understanding that land outlasts individual owners and carries forward the cumulative impacts of human decisions across generations. What had begun as Walter's personal commitment to a promise made at his wife's graveside had expanded into a formal curriculum taught to students ranging from local elementary schoolers to international agricultural researchers. Later that evening, after Jason had taken his son home and Margaret had ensured Walter was comfortable for the night, she returned to her own residence, the modernized cottage near the research center where she now lived half the year, splitting her time between the farm and her continuing legal practice in Boston. From her desk, she could see the lights of the security monitoring station discreetly positioned near the ridgeline, a reminder of the property's dual nature that remained invisible to most visitors. Her laptop displayed recent correspondence from the historical research team that had been gradually processing the Heartland Shield documentation, communications that revealed an even deeper significance to the facility than had initially been understood. According to newly declassified records, the installation beneath Pinewood Valley Farm had played a crucial role during several Cold War crises, serving as a communications backup that had helped maintain command continuity during particularly tense moments in American history. More personally meaningful was evidence that her grandmother Helen had indeed been aware of the facility's existence, having served on a county civil defense committee that coordinated certain logistical arrangements. Without being privy to the technical details, this confirmation of Sullivan's earlier suggestion that Helen had intuited more than was explicitly shared completed another piece of the family's complex relationship with the property. The next morning brought another milestone in the farm's evolution, the arrival of 30 new students for the inaugural semester of the Erickson Agricultural Fellowship Program. Fully funded through a combination of government grants and private endowments, the program would provide immersive education in sustainable farming practices while subtly incorporating principles of land stewardship that aligned with the property's less visible security purposes. Walter, seated on the porch of his residence, watched as the diverse group of young people gathered for their orientation near the heritage barn. Among them were veterans transitioning to agricultural careers, environmental science graduates seeking practical experience, and international students bringing traditional farming knowledge from their own cultures, all drawn by the Erickson Farm's growing reputation as a place where traditional wisdom and innovative approaches converged. "They don't look much like farmers yet," Walter observed, as Margaret joined him for their morning coffee ritual. But neither did Jason when he first arrived. The land has a way of teaching what textbooks can't explain. "And you'll be there to fill in the gaps," Margaret reminded him, knowing how much her father valued his continued role as an advisor and occasional lecturer despite his physical limitations. Walter nodded, his eyes following the students as they began their first tour of the property. Strange to think that Reid believed this land was only valuable for building luxury homes. He never understood what was really worth preserving. The developer whose threats had once seemed so formidable had faded into a cautionary tale, his legal troubles having expanded into a comprehensive investigation that eventually led to federal charges related to foreign influence in strategic property acquisitions. Reid Development Group had dissolved amid bankruptcy and criminal proceedings, its ambitious plans for transforming Riverdale County into a luxury housing enclave replaced by the current agricultural heritage district that was revitalizing the region's farming economy. As if summoned by the mention of past threats, a security vehicle made its scheduled patrol along the farm's perimeter, a routine check that maintained the property's protection without disrupting its daily operations. What had once felt like intrusive surveillance had evolved into a reassuring presence, partners in preservation rather than forces of control. Walter watched the vehicle complete its circuit before turning his attention back to the students exploring his lifelong home. The real secret worth protecting was never what's underneath the farm, he reflected. It was the knowledge of how to work with the land instead of against it. That's what Dad passed to me, and what we're passing forward now. In this observation lay the true transformation that had occurred since the day black SUVs had surrounded the farmhouse with threats of imminent development. What had begun as a desperate fight to save one elderly farmer's property had evolved into a multi-generational commitment to preserving both tangible resources and intangible wisdom, a legacy that would continue shaping lives long after the dramatic helicopter landing that had changed everything 5 years earlier. Don't forget to subscribe to see our next incredible story about a small-town librarian who discovered a hidden message in a donated book that reunited siblings separated during World War II. Drop a comment letting us know if you've ever discovered That something you fought to protect turned out to be even more valuable than you initially realized. Your engagement helps us bring more extraordinary true stories like the Erickson Farm saga to light. The morning sunlight streamed through the east room windows of the White House, casting a warm glow across the assembled guests. In the front row, Margaret Erickson sat beside Jason Reeves and his family, including 10-year-old Jacob, who fidgeted slightly in his formal attire. The boy's discomfort was understandable. Few children his age would feel at ease in such distinguished surroundings, surrounded by government officials, military officers, and media cameras capturing every moment of this historic occasion. It had been precisely 1 decade since the day Marcus Reid's black SUVs had threatened Walter Erickson's farm, setting in motion events that none of the participants could have foreseen. Today, they gathered for a ceremony that would formally enshrine that story in the nation's historical consciousness, the posthumous awarding of the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Walter Erickson, who had passed peacefully in his sleep 6 months earlier at the age of 90. The presidential aide at the podium introduced the ceremony with measured dignity. Today we honor an American whose life exemplified the quiet heroism that has shaped our nation across generations. Walter Erickson never sought recognition or acclaim. He simply did what was right, preserving not only agricultural heritage, but unknowingly protecting a crucial piece of our national security infrastructure for decades. Margaret's thoughts drifted to her father's final years, when he had witnessed the full flowering of what his stubborn stand against development had created. The Erickson Family Agricultural Research Center had expanded into an internationally recognized institution, pioneering drought-resistant crop varieties that were now helping farmers adapt to changing climate conditions across multiple continents. The educational programs he had helped establish had graduated over 500 fellows who carried his methods and philosophy to farming operations worldwide. Most meaningful to Walter in those final years had been the simple pleasure of watching young Jacob grow up on the land that 7 decades earlier his own father had committed to a dual legacy of agricultural production and national service. The boy had inherited Walter's intuitive connection to the soil, along with his grandfather's curious mind, spending hours with the aging farmer, learning lessons that no textbook could provide. The ceremony continued as historical footage played on large screens, showing the evolution of Pinewood Valley Farm from its early days as a struggling family operation to its current status as a model for integrating preservation, education, and security. Brief glimpses of a much younger Walter working his fields with primitive equipment contrasted sharply with the sophisticated research facility that now occupied a portion of the same land. When the president approached the podium, the room fell into respectful silence. Some acts of heroism occur in a single dramatic moment that captures public attention. Others unfold quietly across decades, unrecognized until their full significance becomes clear through the perspective of history. Walter Erickson's life represents this second, more enduring form of heroism, the president continued, relating the now declassified story of how the Heartland Shield facility beneath the Erickson farm had played a crucial role during several Cold War crises. Recently released documents had revealed that during particularly tense moments in the early 1980s, the facility's backup communication systems had maintained critical command continuity when primary systems were compromised, a service to national security that had occurred literally beneath the feet of a farmer who remained focused on tending his crops above. What makes Walter Erickson's story uniquely American is the convergence of individual liberty with national purpose, the president observed. Without government compulsion or interference, 3 generations of the Erickson family maintained stewardship over land that protected both our food security and our national security. They did so not because they were ordered to, but because they understood intuitively that preserving something valuable for future generations is the essence of good citizenship. As the president called Margaret forward to accept the medal on her father's behalf, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The threat that had once loomed over her father's farm had been transformed through a sequence of seemingly chance events into an opportunity that had preserved not just the property, but expanded its purpose beyond anything Walter could have imagined when he stubbornly refused that first buyout offer. On behalf of a grateful nation, I present this Presidential Medal of Freedom to honor Walter Erickson's lifetime of service, the president stated, placing the prestigious medal in Margaret's hands. The accompanying citation highlighted not only Walter's inadvertent role in protecting national security infrastructure, but his conscious commitment to sustainable agricultural practices long before they became mainstream, innovations that were now helping address global food security challenges. When Margaret stepped to the microphone to offer brief acceptance remarks, she found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the distance between this ornate White House ceremony and the simple farmhouse kitchen where her father had first shown her the threatening letters from Reid Development Group. That moment of crisis, which had seemed so devastating at the time, had ultimately led to this extraordinary recognition. My father would have been profoundly uncomfortable with this ceremony, Margaret began, earning gentle laughter from those who had known Walter. He never sought recognition beyond the borders of his fields, but he would have appreciated what this medal represents, not personal glory, but acknowledgement that ordinary work done with extraordinary commitment matters to our nation's well-being. She continued, sharing how Walter had often reflected in his final years that the greatest threat to both agricultural and national security wasn't external enemies, but forgetting what previous generations had learned through hard experience. My father believed that wisdom accumulated slowly across generations, but could be lost in a single generation, if not deliberately preserved and passed forward. His greatest pride was not in what he personally accomplished, but in establishing mechanisms to ensure that knowledge would continue benefiting future generations. Following the ceremony, a more intimate gathering took place at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where a new permanent exhibition titled Heartland Stewardship: The Erickson Farm Legacy was being unveiled. The carefully curated collection included Walter's original farm ledgers, tools that had been used by 3 generations of Ericksons, and selected declassified materials documenting the property's dual significance to agricultural and national security history. Dr. Lawrence Abernathy, now Director Emeritus of the Westfield Historical Society and a key curator for the exhibition, guided special guests through the displays. What makes the Erickson story so compelling is how it embodies the intersection of personal choice and national purpose, he explained. Each generation faced decisions about whether to maintain, sell, or transform the property. Those choices, made for personal and practical reasons, had implications that extended far beyond the farm's boundaries. A central feature of the exhibition was an interactive display showing the chain of events that had begun with Walter's discovery of the bunker entrance and culminated in the establishment of the research center. Visitors could explore how seemingly small decisions, Margaret taking her father's call seriously, Walter refusing initial buyout offers, the historical documentation being preserved rather than destroyed, had collectively created the conditions for transformation rather than loss. Catherine Sullivan, now retired from government service but still actively involved with the Historical Infrastructure Preservation Program, spoke softly to Margaret as they observed young museum visitors engaging with the exhibition. Your father's story has become something of a legend within certain government circles, she revealed. It's taught as a case study in how private citizenship and national service can align without compulsion, a model of how preservation can be achieved through partnership rather than requisition. For Margaret, whose legal career had evolved to focus almost exclusively on agricultural preservation and heritage site protection, the exhibition represented vindication of principles she had advocated throughout her professional life. The documentation of how Pinewood Valley Farm had been threatened and ultimately saved provided powerful precedent for other preservation efforts facing similar development pressure. The exhibition continued into a section focused on the farm's current operations and global impact. Video displays showed international agricultural students learning techniques pioneered by Walter and refined by Jason's research team. Maps indicated locations worldwide where Erickson farming methods had been implemented to address challenges ranging from water scarcity to soil degradation. Jason guided young Jacob through this section, explaining how the innovations developed on their farm were helping communities across multiple continents. The boy listened with growing understanding of how his daily life on a single property in Riverdale County connected to a much larger world of agricultural challenges and solutions. "Will my name be in a museum someday too?" Jacob asked, looking at the display honoring his namesake, Walter's father. "That depends on what you choose to do with the knowledge you're inheriting," Jason replied thoughtfully. "Museums don't commemorate people just for being born into a legacy. They recognize those who build upon what they're given and create something that helps others." This gentle lesson in the responsibility that accompanied privilege reflected the philosophy that had guided the Erickson property through multiple generations and would continue shaping its future. The farm had never been merely a private asset, but a resource whose value derived from how it served larger purposes, whether feeding communities, advancing agricultural knowledge, or protecting national security infrastructure. Later that evening, as the official events concluded, Margaret found a quiet moment to visit the Lincoln Memorial. Sitting on the steps overlooking the reflecting pool, she removed from her pocket a small cloth pouch containing soil from Walter's farm, earth that had been cultivated by 3 generations of her family. It was a personal tradition she maintained when traveling, a tangible connection to the land that remained central to her identity despite her urban professional life. As the monument's lights illuminated the solemn figure of Lincoln, Margaret reflected on how her father's stubborn stand against development had evolved into something far more significant than merely preserving one family's property. The Erickson legacy now encompassed innovative research addressing global food security challenges, educational programs transmitting agricultural knowledge to future generations, and a model for integrating national security interests with private land stewardship. Marcus Reid, whose threats had once seemed so overwhelming, had become a footnote in this larger narrative. Following his conviction on charges related to unauthorized activities near sensitive infrastructure, he had served a brief prison sentence before fading into obscurity. His development empire had collapsed, its assets acquired by competitors who lacked his aggressive approach to acquisition but demonstrated greater respect for community heritage and environmental considerations. The black SUVs that had once surrounded Walter's farmhouse with threatening intent had become symbolic in agricultural preservation circles, a shorthand reference for corporate intimidation tactics that communities could resist through proper documentation and strategic alliance building. Preservation attorneys now specifically trained for black SUV scenarios, using the Erickson case study to prepare landowners facing similar pressure. As Margaret prepared to return to her hotel, her phone chimed with a message from Jason. A photo showing young Jacob asleep in his hotel room, the Presidential Medal of Freedom certificate carefully placed on the nightstand beside him. The image captured perfectly the quiet transfer of values across generations that had characterized the Erickson legacy from its beginning. The medal itself would soon be displayed at the research center in a simple exhibition honoring Walter's life and work. Unlike the elaborate Smithsonian presentation, this local memorial would focus on the personal qualities that had enabled Walter to stand firm when facing seemingly insurmountable pressure: the quiet determination, unwavering commitment to principle, and deep connection to place that had ultimately saved not just a farm, but a unique convergence of agricultural heritage and national security resources. 1 decade after development threats had nearly erased Pinewood Valley Farm from the landscape, it had instead become a national model for preservation, its story enshrined in the country's historical narrative. The elderly farmer who had simply sought to honor a promise made at his wife's graveside had inadvertently created a legacy that would continue influencing agricultural practices, preservation policies, and security protocols long after his name faded from public memory. What remained was the land itself, still producing crops, still protecting its underground secrets, still teaching lessons to those willing to listen. The soil that had sustained the Erickson family for generations now nourished a broader community of purpose, connecting past wisdom to future innovation through the simple, profound act of cultivation. As night fell over Washington, the capital city, where power often seemed concentrated in grand monuments and institutions, the true impact of Walter Erickson's life could be found not in the medal bearing his name or the exhibition recounting his story, but in fields 100 miles away where young apprentices were learning to work with, rather than against, the rhythms of the natural world, lessons as old as agriculture itself, yet perpetually renewable when transmitted from one generation to the next. The presidential helicopter that had once landed dramatically in Walter's east pasture had departed long ago. But what it had helped preserve continued growing, adapting, and nourishing both body and spirit in ways that transcended the specific crisis that had prompted its arrival. Before we conclude this incredible true story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more inspirational journeys through America's hidden history. Drop a comment sharing what aspect of Walter Erickson's legacy resonates most with you: his dedication to the land, his stand against powerful interests, or the unexpected way his personal choices connected to national purpose. Tomorrow, we'll bring you the astonishing story of a forgotten female mathematician whose calculations in 1957 quietly saved a mission but remained unacknowledged for 6 decades. Your support helps us continue sharing these remarkable American stories that remind us how ordinary people shape our nation's destiny through seemingly small but profoundly consequential choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.